Hello everybody, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I've got a really special episode for you today. I'm going to be talking about one person's lifelong experiences with UFOs and the paranormal. It's a truly extraordinary story. I call this episode the Spaceship House. It's all about the experiences of a gentleman by the name of Joe Gardner. He's this amazing guy from West Virginia. He's worked a variety of jobs, but really he's an artist, and a very good one, very accomplished. His stuff is amazing, but his experiences are off the charts, unbelievably extensive, a wide variety of encounters. He's had many sightings, some of which he's actually captured on photographs, but has experienced landings as well. Couple of really amazing and truly extensive onboard experiences. And a lot more than that, a lot of paranormal stuff. I was very blessed to be contacted by him. His story is told in my book, Onboard UFO Encounters. This is my most popular best-selling book, and it was a real treat to interview him because, yeah, it's not often that I get to talk to somebody who's had this level of experiences, this level of conscious contact. He provides some really extraordinary insights into the nature of the UFO phenomena, and his experiences are so amazing. So let's just get started because, yeah, he's got a lot to share. The first segment that I want to talk about, I call the first sighting. As you may know, people who are contactees often have experiences at a very young age. And that's certainly true of Joe. He had a really amazing close-up UFO sighting with his mother when he was just 5 years old. The first hint of anything unusual in Joe's life began with a voice. Again, he was 5 years old when he heard someone saying, "Jojo, Jojo." It was a sing-song voice playfully calling his name in his mind. And as Joe says, I was almost 5 years old, standing in front of Foodland. My mother and I were standing in the parking lot waiting for a cab to take us home. So this was 1974, Huntington, West Virginia. It was a bright sunny day. Joe had brought his little red wagon and they had actually planned to walk home, but there were too many bags of groceries, so Joe's mother decided to call a cab. They were waiting for the cab when Joe looked up after hearing this voice and saw a, quote, grayish cylinder high in the sky. It looked like it was rotating, but was otherwise stationary. So he turned to his mom and said, "Mom, what's that up there? What is that?" So Joe's mother looked up and said, "It's a satellite or something." She seemed unconcerned at the time, but later she admitted it looked more like a, quote, gray disc. Now to Joe it looked more like an unmarked can of soda pop, metallic silver, glinting in the sun as it twirled in space. So they got into the cab. The object was still overhead, hovering in place as they drove off. Joe always remembered this sighting, but he never really thought much about it. He just kind of filed it in the back of his mind. But soon other strange things began to happen, including, of course, a missing time incident, which he also forgot about. But this would come rushing back into his mind later as an adult, and there were other events. How cool is that? A metallic disc seen during daylight hours. He had another witness. He's very lucky that way. A lot of people are very much alone with their experiences. But no, like I said, he's got a lot of corroborating witnesses. And that's how it all began for him. But certainly this was not the end of it. Hardly. His experiences were only just beginning. And in fact, shortly following this, he and his family took a drive and had an incredible encounter, which quickly became shrouded in missing time. He had many strange experiences following this, but they also became shrouded in this kind of amnesia. He didn't think about them. He absolutely, completely forgot about them. This is a pattern we see in quite a number of cases. But soon the memories would come back. And it was really interesting how this all happened. He was an adult and he had this major awakening following some really extraordinary sightings. He had 2 sightings in a row, and this changed everything. So I call this next segment The Awakening. So life went on. Joe went to school. He did really well. He moved up into the gifted class. He remained there for a couple of years. He always studied hard. And finally completing school, Joe went to college. He studied for a degree in art. This time UFOs were the farthest thing from his mind, but that changed. At 6:45 a.m. precisely on January 27, 1997, Joe was 22 years old. His life changed forever. It was an icy cold morning, crystal clear. Dawn was just beginning to break on the eastern horizon. Most of the sky was still black and full of stars. It was a beautiful sight, and as Joe looked towards the strip of blue sky on the horizon, this is when he noticed something moving. As he says, "This thing caught my attention. It was a huge green sphere, absolutely huge. It looked like a big green snowball with a white center. It started out on the horizon and kind of followed an arc across the sky. At one point, it was almost directly above me. Then it passed over towards Ohio to the darker part of the sky, and it just kept getting smaller, disappearing. And I kept telling myself, that can't be what I think it is. That can't be." And I had the most sickening, repulsive feeling in my stomach. I wanted to go somewhere and hide. I kept shaking my head and saying, "No, no, no, they don't exist. Those things just don't exist." So this sighting impressed him deeply. He was a college student at the time, earning a degree in fine art. And he says, "It took me by surprise. It shocked me. I was full of awe, but in a way I had this sickening feeling in my stomach." So he wasn't quite sure why, but for some reason this sighting really left him shaken. It was strange, because he normally didn't scare easily. He excelled at sports. He would later work as a bouncer and had to kick some big guys out of the bar. But as he says, when you see something like that, you start to question your eyes. You start to question all your senses, your faculties. So Joe found himself staring at the night sky, taking early morning walks with his dog, hoping to see this again. He couldn't get it out of his mind. It really affected him to the point where he finally went to a psychology clinic at the university and talked to a therapist. And after hearing his story, the therapist told him that he was suffering from depression and that this had caused him to, quote, "see lights." And she prescribed an antidepressant. So Joe was not happy about this. He left the office angry, disappointed, and it wasn't long before he realized he actually got off lucky. He would later share his story with others who vehemently told him that UFOs were demonic and that he must not associate himself with them. But it was just 2 years later, April 7, 1999, he had another sighting. He was working late as a bill collector at the time, so when he got home, he went outside to walk his dog. This was just before midnight, and as Joe says, "My dog was doing her business right on the edge of the fence. I looked away out of respect for my dog, and this thing appeared directly in front of me. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. It was like a piece of a crystal chandelier, like 2 pyramids stuck together, like a diamond with facets. No pun intended, it was like a diamond in the sky. It was like it was made out of glass, and it had a strobing light inside of it, white hot, like a welder's arc. It was strobing so fast it kind of distorted your perception. So this object appeared to be a few thousand feet high, still pretty low, hovering to the southeast, right outside of town it appeared. As Joe says, it wasn't too far away. I could see the edges of it very clearly. It had blue and green flames racing all around the outline of it. The object itself was white crystalline. It was rotating like a child's top, just hovering in one place. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because the moment he saw it, a powerful rush of good feelings swept through him. He thought to this object, "I see you. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" And as Joe says, "The next thing I know, it was like somebody hit me on the back of the head with a sledgehammer. No, not now." I looked at the thing, and it sent a column of white light, like a fluorescent tube, straight to the ground. It looked solid, and then it just blinked out. The column of light disappeared too. So Joe scanned the skies but saw no sign of the object. He continued his walk, still looking for this UFO, but he was also still overwhelmed by this incredible feeling of goodness. As he says, "I'll tell you, I never felt so good in my life. I've loved a few women, and they've loved me, but I've never felt such strong emotions as I did that night. It was like I saw a long-lost relative or a dear, dear long-time friend. I was blissed out for 3 days. I just had this overwhelming, peaceful, beautiful feeling in my heart. I could just feel my heart spilling over. It was lovely. I felt like I needed to go somewhere and pray." So this really spiritually transformed him to a degree that he started attending church with his dad, became more interested in God and spirituality. He started keeping a diary to record this and other encounters. Ultimately, it really sparked his interest in UFOs, and he began to educate himself about this subject. And he also began to examine his own history of UFO sightings. He had just experienced these 2 incredible UFO encounters in a row, and he wondered, could this be a coincidence? So as he thought about it, he remembered that this wasn't the first time he had seen a UFO. There was the incident at the grocery store when he was 4 or 5 years old, and then there was this time he had gone driving with his family to go blackberry picking. This was the time that they had seen what they called, quote, the Spaceship House. And as he meditated on it, he remembered that this was more than just seeing an unusual house. This was a landed UFO, and he started to recall being taken on board. As these memories started to come back, he finally consulted with UFO researchers such as Donnie Joe Blessing and Leo Sprinkle, and taking their advice and using meditation, he was soon able to recall that yes, he had in fact come upon a landed UFO and was taken on board. This is another pattern I see with a lot of contactees. They can go through life not really realizing that they're contactees until something happens. There's a trigger or a cue that really wakes them up and makes them look back at their childhood in a new way and realize, something did happen to me. They kind of are lifted out of denial and explaining away cases or filing them away and not thinking about them. This is absolutely what happened to Joe. He started looking back at this childhood experience where he went driving with his parents and saw what they call a spaceship house. And boy, it was more than just seeing a landed UFO. He now remembered, of course, being taken on board. And this is one of the most extensive and interesting onboard encounters I've ever heard. I think you'll find it really fascinating. It was just a few months after his sighting at the Foodland market. This was now the summer of 1974. Joe and his family left their home in Huntington and drove west into Kentucky, just a short distance away. They were going to pick blackberries, which grew wild along the roads just off the main highway. This was something they had done many times before. With Joe was his dad, Joe Sr., Joe's mom, and sister, who was not quite a year older than Joe. So they drove into Kentucky, pulled off onto County Road 9 off the main highway. They were looking for blackberry bushes when Joe's dad said, "Hey, look at that funny spaceship house." Now Joe was sitting directly behind his father in the back seat and looked to his left and saw what caught his father's attention. It was just off the side of the road, nestled inconspicuously among the trees at the head of a holler, and as Joe says, "I looked and glanced at it. It looked like a highly polished aluminum. It was more or less like a flattened ovoid shape, but it had a rim around it, and it was sitting on stilts, on legs. It was probably 30 feet in diameter, and it had 2 little round portholes along the bottom." So they all looked at this and marveled at how strange it was, but they drove on, and although he only saw it for a few seconds, for some reason Joe was electrified by this sight, and shortly after they passed it, he knew he had to say something to his dad. As he says, "It just struck me. That's a once-in-a-lifetime chance right there." So I pleaded with him. Joe told his dad, "Please, please, please take us back. I want to see it again. Let's go see the spaceship house. I want to see it. Let's go see the spaceship house." And he just kept pestering his father. And because of Joe's constant requests, Joe Sr. abruptly pulled a U-turn and drove back to this spaceship house. Now this structure was about 150 feet off the road, hidden among the trees. Weirdly, there was no driveway, no sidewalk, no electrical wires. Joe Sr. got out of the car, approached it first, and Joe followed after him. And in just a few moments, they stood right beside it, close enough to touch it. They could see these two round windows on the bottom, dark. And his father said, "This is weird. Don't you move. You stay right there." And Joe's father began to walk around the object. As Joe says, "We thought it odd that there wasn't a front door. I just thought it was so neat. It was kind of white aluminum. There were no panels on it. It was among the trees in the shade. There were some windows around the bottom, and there were more windows around the top. I was too short to look into the windows that were on the top. I just stayed where my dad told me. I stood right where I was at, and I put my hand on one of the metal support legs. And I remember, it was like touching ice." So the more they looked, the more they realized how strange this was. As Joe says, "The house was on stilts. It had round windows and an upper deck that kind of ran around the whole perimeter. My dad walked around the back to find a door, and when he came around the other side, he had the most puzzled look on his face. He stood beside me and he scratched his head. 'Well, that's funny,' he said. 'There's no back door.' He pointed out that there were no power lines and no gas meter, and he said, 'This must be one of those new solar power energy homes. It doesn't have any wires going into it.' So at that point, Joe's father actually banged his fist against the side of it, making the entire object emit a loud metallic clang, and he called out, 'Hello! Hello! Anybody home? Hello?' So Joe, at this point, tried to look into the darkened windows on the bottom of the craft, and this is when he suddenly heard a voice coming from above. He said it was a strange voice. It sounded old, kind of crackly and high-pitched, and it said, 'Up here! Up here!' Joe looked up and was amazed by what he saw. As he says, it was a long, skinny, kind of grayish arm with 3 fingers, and they were using the fingers to kind of wave us up. So his father was still banging his fist against this object, and Joe tugged on his shirt and said, 'Look! Look up there!' And at that moment that a thin, metallic grate staircase extruded from the side of the craft. It was very lightly constructed, very narrow. Joe Sr. picked up little Joe, turned sideways, and together they scaled these stairs, this ladder. It flexed under their weight. At the top was an open doorway with a strange, featureless silver door, apparently hinged on the left side. So that's how this encounter began. And in fact, he did remember quite a bit of this fully consciously, but just didn't think about it. It took a lot more work to recall what happened inside the craft. But he did, and what he recalled is amazing. When a person is taken on board a craft, the events they describe usually follow a fairly set pattern, and that's certainly true in Joe's case. But he has many experiences that I've heard other people describe. For some people it's a simple exam or something along those lines. With Joe, it was quite a lot more than just that. But here's how his experience began with going inside the craft. The first thing Joe noticed was a figure, a very odd-looking man sitting in what looked to him like an upholstered chair. And as Joe says, he had big black eyes, like an ant, a big round head, spindly arms, a spindly body. He was wearing a green plaid shirt, blue jeans, and boots. But when he stood up, he really looked like a bug, because he was tall. He welcomed us inside. So at this point, Joe shouts out, "Dad, that man looks like a big bug." Now his father immediately chided him and said, "Don't say that. That's rude. It's not nice." This surprised Joe, because he couldn't believe that his father couldn't see what this man looked like. He was obviously not normal, and yet Joe's father didn't seem to notice this. Looking around, Joe could see that they were now in a large round room, fully lit with bright white light coming from no discernible source. The floors curved up into the walls and the ceiling. A small shelf or a counter encircled about a third of the room was made of the same material as the wall. No visible seams, no designs. It was as if the entire structure was molded out of one single piece. So Joe's father said, "Wow, this is interesting. Where do you get your power from?" The man in the craft proceeded to open some low cabinets and showed Joe's father the contents. Now Joe was eager to see this, so he tried to squeeze between them, at which point his father became angry and pushed him back, and told him, "You don't know what you're looking at here, boy. You don't understand this." Joe staggered back, and the man spoke to him. The man in the UFO spoke to Joe and said, "There's something to eat and drink on the table over there." So Joe looked, and he saw a small pedestal-type table, and there was a plate and a cup, or what looked like a plate and a cup. The plate held a small number of little black disc-shaped objects, which Joe assumed were chocolate cookies. As Joe says, "I got excited. I ran over there, picked one up, and bit into it, and it was bitter. Terribly bitter. In fact, this cookie tasted so bad," Joe said, "that he immediately put the rest of it back on the plate and looked around for some place to spit the nasty stuff out of his mouth. But as he says, there was no trash can anywhere, so I just swallowed it out of politeness." Now, hoping to wash the bitter taste from his mouth, he looked at the strange cup. He said it was a tall tumbler, very heavy, with thick sides. It looked almost like it was made of stone or pottery, and inside it held a greenish yellow liquid with a viscosity closer to pancake batter than juice. So Joe had to use both hands to grip this cup up and tilt the liquid into his mouth. And as he says, "As soon as it hit my mouth, I just blacked out. The next thing I knew, when I came to, conscious and awake, I was lying on a cold metal table. I couldn't move at all. I couldn't move anything but my eyes." How interesting is that? That Joe's father didn't even seem to recognize that he was dealing with ETs and thought this was just a average person. Perhaps not average, but not extraterrestrial. He didn't realize it at first. Of course, he later would. And this is, Joe blacks out after being given this drink. This also is something a number of contactees describe, being given something to drink or even something to eat. Both were true in Joe's case. But what followed here was what most people will describe if they're taken on board, is being physically examined. This was for Joe the hardest part of his experience. It was the most scary, the most confusing. And I think that's true for a lot of contactees. And in fact, it's the physical exam that often people who are contactees will have a real hard time with, and it might cause them to label an experience as negative or certainly unpleasant. So yeah, for Joe, this was the most difficult part of the experience, but it wasn't all that happened. And when he looked at the events that followed, he kind of took a much more expansive viewpoint of what was going on. But I call this next segment the examination. Now, when Joe had entered the craft, he was dressed in blue shorts, he had a yellow and brown striped shirt, shoes, but now he had no clothes on except for his shirt. And he was laying on this table on his left side in a kind of fetal position. In front of him, he saw his father, who was sitting on a bench at the side of the room. And as Joe says, he's just sitting there, and he's got his hands on top of his legs, his mouth open, his eyes wide open and unblinking. And I'm looking at him and pleading with him. I can't cry, I can't shout, I can't wave to him. I can't do anything but look at him with my eyes and think with my mind, "Dad, help me. Help me, Dad. Please, help me." But he looked like he was asleep with his eyes open. Joe could see that there was a light shining down on him from above, and walking around the table and into his field of view at this point was a figure who appeared to be wearing a white smock, much like a doctor's uniform. And he saw this being's arm and hand, which he said had 3 long, smooth fingers. As Joe says, the fingers were kind of wrapped around what looked like a long stainless steel knife, with a handle made of the same metal. Now, for the first time since this encounter began, Joe started to feel real distress. He thought to himself, "They're monsters. They're going to eat us." And what happened next was perhaps the most unpleasant part of his experience so far. As he says, I felt something very cold and hard, like a rod or a cold pipe, just go up inside me, and then I blanked out again. What Joe describes is in many ways fairly typical. I suspect there might be more to that, but he is not recalling it because it is unpleasant or was unpleasant for him, which I certainly understand. Again, this is probably the most difficult part for people who have onboard experiences. And I think, again, this is what causes some people to label an experience as negative or unpleasant or scary. But Joe recalled so much more. And it's this next part of his experience that to me is the most fascinating, because it's not often that people get to have this level of recall of what's going on during an onboard experience. I think perhaps because he was a young child. Contactees also have an extraordinary memory. So I think that might be part of what's going on here. At any rate, I call this next segment the tour of the craft. And this is something that happens to a lot of contactees. And in Joe's case, it's so amazing. The next thing Joe knew, he was waking up and he heard his name being called. Joe! Jojo! It was a woman's voice, very soft. And as Joe says, when I came to, there was a tall gray. It was like she was there to be reassuring. She was kind of soft-natured, and she had these big, large almond eyes, real liquidy, a very slight mouth, just an indentation, but it had a slight smile. No nose, no ear holes, I couldn't see any hair. Now most strange was that this gray had a kind of sparkly aura of glittering, glowing particles that appeared to be swirling in a vortex around her head. But she was very gentle, very comforting as she roused Joe to full wakefulness. This gray held Joe's right hand and telepathically asked him, "Would you like to see the ship?" And Joe said, "Yeah." So this gray helped him down off the table. Joe could now see that the table was not symmetrical, but instead appeared to be curved, with a minor dip in the center. The bright light that had been above him was now gone. The room seemed enveloped in a kind of hazy twilight. There was kind of a low-lying fog or mist swirling around the base of the floor. Joe could smell something like sulfur, an acrid odor. But this female gray led Joe up a shallow ramp, which appeared to spiral around a central column and up to a higher level. So they climbed up, leaving this room behind. While Joe had to walk, the female gray seemed to glide upwards without even moving her legs. And once on this upper deck, Joe now saw that the floor, which had been white, now appeared like smoothly polished black obsidian glass. And the room itself was so large he couldn't even see any walls. And instead, his attention was drawn to 3 chairs, much like you'd see in a dental office, he said, with a large pedestal-like base, a footrest, thick armrests, other equipment. The chairs were all in a row, and sitting in each one was a member of his family, his father, his mother, and his sister. They were reclined backwards and not moving. A cone of light shone down from above over each of them. Otherwise, the room was dark, and there was a blur of activity swirling like a whirlwind around each of them. The movement was so rapid, Joe was not fully able to register what he was seeing. But when he saw his sister sitting there with her mouth and eyes wide open, with all that weird activity around her, he became frightened and upset, and he screamed out, "Stop! Stop!" And he pointed at his sister and said, "You're hurting my sister! You've got to stop!" At this point, the gray leaned down, placed her forehead against Joe's forehead, and told him telepathically, "It's just a checkup. It's okay. It's just a checkup." And she repeated it several times until Joe finally calmed down. Joe still couldn't see any walls, but it was clear that this structure that he was in, this spaceship house, was far larger on the inside than it had appeared on the outside. Now, still holding his hand, the gray asked Joe, "Would you like to see the stars?" And Joe said yes. As Joe says, "So she took me up to an upper level where I could definitely see we were under some kind of dome. I'm not sure how big, but it was pretty expansive, and we could see the stars through the dome." At this point, the gray was peering upwards at the stars with what appeared to Joe to be rapt wonder and fascination. She seemed more impressed by the view than Joe himself was. Thinking that there must be something else up there to see, he turned his attention back to the view, but it was just a field of stars. So he turned to the gray and said, "Wow, there's so many of them." So there you go. That's Joe's onboard experience. He wasn't able to recall much more than that. His next memory is actually waking up and being back in the family car. But an amazing onboard experience involving a physical exam, a tour of the craft, some messages. These are the kinds of events that people often describe when they're taken on board. And it took, again, Joe a long time to remember all of this, but what happened next is something that he recalled pretty much fully consciously right away, just buried it, didn't think much about it. And this I call the return. This is often a very memorable part of a person's experience because they realized they had missing time. So yeah, the whole family went through this, and it's really quite extraordinary. So Joe really can't say whether or not there was more to this experience. All he can say is he experienced a sort of memory lapse, as if it was a slice of time gone from his life, and the next thing he remembers is sitting in the back seat of the car, again behind his dad. And he says it's almost as if the car hit the ground with a thud. They were going 70, 80 miles per hour. His mom was hysterical. His dad was screaming, near hysterics. And Joe's mother was screaming, "What happened? What happened?" She was crying. So was Joe's sister, who was now crouched down in her seat, practically under the seat. Joe tried to sit up, and his dad screamed at him, "Get down in the seat! Get down!" Joe's mother was still screaming, "What happened?" And Joe said, "Them damn people are weird." So as Joe says, "I tried to get up out of the seat, off the floor there. I wanted to look. I looked out the rear window, and I saw a bright light and two figures in front of the light, two silhouettes, like paper dolls. The air was really heavy. I remember a smell in the air. My dad was upset. He was damn angry. My mother was hysterical." So Joe's mother just kept repeating, "What happened? What happened, Joe?" And Joe Sr. said, "I don't know, but I'm gonna kill them." Joe had never seen his father cry before, but now his tears were flowing, and his father was just swearing. He said, "Those no good son of a bitches," said all kinds of curse words, and said, "I'm gonna kill them. I'm gonna kill them." So he was angry. They raced down the road, just trying to put space between themselves and this incident, and drove for several minutes when Joe's mother suddenly asked, "Where's the refinery? We should be able to see it." Because there was this large, highly visible oil refinery nearby in Catlettsburg, Kentucky. These smokestacks were visible for miles around, and at that point they should have been near it, but there was no sign of it. They realized that they were somewhere else, in an unfamiliar area. And as Joe's father said, "I think we got lost." So he pulled a U-turn, very eager to return home. They raced back in the other direction when, without warning, their speed was halted by a thick wall of fog stretching across the width of the road. As Joe says, it was a big wall of fog, a thick wall. And then that smell came back, that sulfur smell. And we had to slow down. So they were just crawling along when after a few minutes they saw this bright red strobing light. And Joe couldn't believe what he saw next. As he says, "As we came through that embankment of fog, there was a big red fire engine, parked at an angle, blocking almost all the road. And it looked just like the toy fire engine I had at home, with a ladder on it. The headlights were on. There was one single solitary fireman standing in front of the fire truck holding a hose, and he had a big smile on his face. He was just waving at us. He was wearing a yellow fireman slicker with a big hat, and he looked just like the fireman I had seen on the wall at school." So later in hindsight, Joe's thinking this is probably a screen memory, but at any point they had to pull off onto the shoulder to move past this truck, and they immediately got out of the fog. They found the signposts leading to home. Joe's father was still seething with anger while his sister was crying and his mom kept saying, what happened? But as Joe says, there was just this uneasy quiet as we got home. We pulled into the driveway, we got out of the car, my mom's still crying and hysterical. My dad has calmed down, but he's not talking. He's carrying my sister who's just sobbing, and I'm walking alongside them, and I'm like, why are they so upset? Why is everyone so hysterical? So Joe's mother turns to his dad and said, what happened, Joe? And Joe's dad says, I don't know. I don't know. This confused Joe because he knew exactly what happened, and he said so. He announced loudly, we were on a spaceship. Don't you remember? At this point, Joe's parents looked at him with incredulous shock. They stumbled back inside. Joe's mother looked at the clock. It was now 2 a.m. This blueberry picking trip, which should have taken an hour or two, had taken 10 hours or more. And as Joe says, I'll never forget that night. We all fell asleep in a big pile in the middle of the living room floor. My dad was clutching me so tightly that I had to peel his fingers back to get up and go to the bathroom in the morning. We were all laying in a pile in the middle of the floor. As you can imagine, an experience like that is hard to forget. When you have that long of missing time, so many people involved, it's going to be something that people are going to remember. So that was really what allowed Joe to dig back into his memory and confirm that something happened and he needed to remember this missing time, which he was able to do fully consciously without the aid of hypnosis. That's an important detail because there are some skeptics out there who say, this is all just hypnotic recall. Not true. In fact, it's rare that I talk to witnesses who've used hypnosis to recall their encounters. Certainly it does happen, but I can tell you that in the books I've written, it's about 10 to 20% of involving cases recalled through hypnosis. So that's another thing I really like about Joe's encounters. He remembered them fully consciously. Now, this next segment is important because having an onboard encounter, or really even just a sighting in some cases, can be transformative. It changes a person's life forever. And that's absolutely true in Joe's case. And not only that, there are some consequences. You start talking about what happened to you and people kind of push back. They might not believe you. You might become the subject of ridicule and disbelief. So Joe had to deal with that. And it actually went much farther than just that. But following this, they all reacted in different ways. Joe's sister completely denied it ever happened, refused to discuss it. Joe's mother only remembered seeing this flying saucer house alongside the road, and Joe's father would not talk about it. But for Joe, he was deeply impacted. He remembered quite a bit of it. He started drawing the craft over and over again, trying to get the details correct. His father caught him doing this, took these pictures, crumpled them up, and threw them in the trash. But it didn't stop Joe from drawing more pictures, which he hid beneath his bed. His father found those and destroyed them too. Now, Joe had just started kindergarten, and he was talking to everyone he met about being taken on board this spaceship, and still drew pictures of this craft, and pictures of this weird bug-like man he had seen on board. Once again, his father found the pictures and threw them away, and Joe still talked. It was a month or two after the encounter. 2 of Joe's young cousins visited, and he told them, me and my dad went on a spaceship together. We were on a spaceship. They're like, no, you're lying. But, as Joe says, just then my dad had walked in from work, and he walked past my bedroom, and one of them said, Mr. G, did y'all go on a spaceship? And he didn't say a word, but he nodded his head yes, and then just walked on by. That's the only time he ever acknowledged it. I felt full of pride right there and then, and I was like, aha, see? And my cousins were like, wow. Now, just a few weeks later, something happened which would make Joe bury this experience in his mind for years. It was after school. A man drove up in a sedan, came to the front door. He was wearing a dark suit, mirrored sunglasses. Joe's father and the man talked privately for several minutes, and the man left. And as Joe says, I'll never forget it. When the man left, my dad came in and he picked me up off the floor with both hands on my shoulders, holding me to the wall, throttling me and shaking me. And his father said, "You gotta stop talking about this stuff." He was nearly at the point of tears. And Joe's like, "Well, what? About the spaceship?" His father said, "Yes. Stop talking about it. They're going to lock us up in the nut house." And Joe was crying at this point and said, "But you were there, Dad. You were there." His dad said, "I know, but you gotta stop talking about this, or they're going to take you kids away and lock us up in the nut house." So as you can imagine, Joe is devastated because he knew he was telling the truth. He really had been on a spaceship. It didn't seem fair to him that he couldn't talk about it, but that incident was enough to make him stop talking. And in fact, he did his best not to even think about it, just forget about it. This had a huge effect on him. As Joe says, it was pretty traumatizing. Basically, you shut up. After my dad said, "You've got to quit talking about this," I actively buried it because it made me so sad. I was filled with depression. I can't talk about something that was real. So yeah, Joe effectively locked this experience up in his mind and didn't think about it. Such a shame, really poignant. A person can have this amazing experience and essentially they're not able to talk about it. There's the trauma of the experience itself, and then there's the aftermath, the trauma of people's reactions to it. And then being visited by a men in black, basically threatened, that really shook Joe up. And again, it was that reaction that really caused him to stop thinking about this, bury it, live a normal life, deal with it later. But he did. So it's amazing that he was able to, work through all of this and recall it fully consciously. And that one onboard experience was not his only onboard experience. It was just a short time later, a few years, he had an even more extraordinary and wholly benevolent encounter, being taken on board, meeting a human like E.T., and going on this fantastic journey into outer space. I call this next segment the trip to Saturn. And boy, is this interesting, and very much like some other accounts of people I've interviewed. It was 3 years after that, Joe is now 8 years old in 3rd grade, that he woke up one evening in his bedroom to hear his name being called. Again, it was the same. Jojo, Jojo. It was a male voice, softly echoing telepathically in his mind. So Joe sat up in bed. His sister was asleep on the other side of the room in her bed, and he heard this name again, echoing in his head. Still, he looked around for the source, trying to figure out who was calling him. He went to his sister's bed, tried to wake her up, but could not wake her up. And as Joe says, "I looked outside the window, and I could see across the street by the railroad tracks a man on top of a dark saucer. He had his left hand on his hip, and he was waving at me with his right hand. And that's when I realized the voice was coming from him." So the man at this point told him telepathically, "Do you want to go for a ride?" So Joe was thrilled with delight. He said yes. He lived on the 2nd-story bedroom. They had a very creaky wooden staircase, so he had to scoot down the steps on his bottom so it wouldn't make any noise and wake anybody up. He undid the deadbolt on the front door, and wearing only pajamas and a pair of socks, he crept across the street up to this flying saucer. And as he says, it was on stilts. It reminded me of the first one, but it was all black and didn't have a rim on it. It had a ladder I had to climb up. So Joe scrambled up this ladder. The man now stood in a doorway and invited Joe inside, and he appeared to be totally human. He wore a one-piece jumpsuit that covered his entire body from head to toe, much like a scuba suit, Joe says, except there was an earpiece and an antenna alongside his head. A visor covered his eyes, so the only opening was a small oval around the mouth. Joe could see he had white skin, no facial hair. The man smiled, very friendly, led Joe to a large chair near the center of the room. The man sat in the chair and scooted back and placed Joe on the chair as well. And Joe was now amazed to see the walls fade away and become completely transparent. As Joe says, it was like you were sitting in Wonder Woman's jet. Everything was just transparent. So other than the chair and some controls, the craft was now invisible. He could see two levers, kind of hand-sized, much like joysticks, side by side in front of him. One lever, the man said, controlled acceleration, while the other controlled the steering. And he placed Joe's hands on the levers and instructed him on how to fly this craft. And he asked him, "Do you want to see a bird's eye view of your house?" And he pulled on the levers, and suddenly the craft was over their house. Joe peered down, amazed to see how high up they were. And the man then said, "Do you want to see a bird's eye view of your school?" And Joe said, "Sure." So the man continued to use this term, bird's eye view, and led Joe farther and farther upward over the city and then over the earth itself. And he couldn't believe it. He could now see the earth just hanging there. It was one of many images from this encounter that Joe would never forget. But this is when it got even more amazing, because the man said, "Do you want to see Saturn?" Joe at this point was distracted by the view below him, and he was struggling to think, "What's Saturn?" he asked the man. And this man was smiling, clearly enjoying Joe's enthusiasm, and said, "It's the planet with the rings." And Joe said yes. And he was amazed to watch the stars suddenly race by. He saw what looked like another planet go whizzing by, and then suddenly there was Saturn. Joe was amazed, because this was not a dream. This was really happening. And staring at Saturn, Joe now remembered seeing this planet in their encyclopedias at home. At some point they turned around. As Joe says, "I don't remember much conversation on the way back, other than it seemed like he was having a good time watching me have a good time. Like you're watching a kid play with a toy." He had a smile. So they returned home, hovered above the earth, and as Joe says, at one point, he let me power the craft. So Joe took the controls, and as soon as he did, he accidentally drove the craft right into the ground. And as he says, "I could see the rocks. We were passing through the rocks, and there were all these sparks flying, dirt, everything." At this point, the man laughed good-naturedly, took the controls back, and guided this craft back towards Joe's home, and told Joe, "Don't talk about this." He was speaking out loud at this point. And this upset Joe, because he's like, "Well, why can't I? It's not a lie. If it's not a lie, why can't I talk about it?" And the man just said, "No, you can't tell kids about this. And I know you want to. Don't talk about this because they'll tease you, just like they tease you about being fat. You know how they make fun of you because you're heavy and it makes you feel bad?" Joe's like, "Yeah." The man said, "They'll tease you about this in the same way." So Joe said, "Okay," though he would later disobey this. And then the man gave him some advice, placing great importance and emphasis upon it. And he said to Joe, "Study science, astronomy, and math." Joe promised that he would, and the next thing he knew, he was back in bed. Of course, the following day, Joe couldn't resist telling his best friend. As he said, "I felt like if I could just tell one person, I had to tell him. But he didn't believe me." Joe came away from this experience absolutely convinced it was real. As he says, "For days I had this phantom feeling in my hands of touching the joystick and the lever. I had this phantom feeling in my hands for days and days and days." But once again, like the prior experience, he slowly forgot about it or didn't think about it, just shelved it away and forgot about it. That is so amazing to me. I've talked to a lot of people, and yeah, sometimes they will be taken to the observation deck and shown a field of stars, the earth down below. Joe had that in his previous experience. But in this one, he was taken to see the planet Saturn. How cool is that? I've only heard that a handful of times, but a number of people have reported exactly this. Also super interesting is that they put him down in the seat and let him pilot the craft. How amazing. Grant Cameron, of course, wrote a book called Sky Pilots, which profiles dozens of cases of people who've had that experience. And as you may know, I interviewed a lady by the name of Dolly Safran who had a lifetime of these kinds of experiences. So my point is, it's not unique. This is something ETs do. They will take you up to the control room and teach you how to pilot the craft. It's so interesting. Now, Joe, having remembered these two onboard encounters, which again were largely shrouded in amnesia, or he just pushed them into a drawer and didn't think about them, he started to look at his past in a different way, and he wondered, like many contactees do, am I the only one in my family who's having these experiences? So he started asking around. He asked his mother and got a huge shock and some real confirmation when she described an amazing sighting that was clearly more than just a sighting. So I call this one a history of encounters. And this is true for almost all contactees. It's generational. And that's true in Joe's case. So years go by and he has those two amazing encounters that cause him to wake up and really dive deep and remember all of this. And this is when he decided he was going to talk to his mom. And he learned that she still remembered seeing the flying saucer back at Foodland. And then he asked her, have you seen anything else? And it turned out she had when she was a little girl. She said, long before Joe was even born, she was 8 years old, living in her parents' home in Wheeling, West Virginia. She had come home from school and went outside to play with her toys under the tree in the front yard and got this creepy feeling that somebody was watching her. She looked up and saw this dark, football-shaped object hovering overhead. It immediately tilted towards her, revealing itself now to be more saucer-shaped, and it then dropped from the sky, moved towards her, at which point she blacked out. What seemed like moments later, she was still under the tree, only it was now dark. And knowing she would be in deep trouble for being out after dark, she scooped up her toys and ran back inside. And opening the door, she was confronted by her entire extended family. Many of them were clustered around the family's only phone, and everybody was utterly shocked to see her and rushed over to her and asked her, where have you been? And she said, I've been out playing under the tree with my toys. And they said, no, you haven't. Look at the clock. So she looked at the clock and could now see it was after 9 p.m. She had seen this UFO shortly after 3 p.m. This meant that there were 6 hours she could not remember. And her mother asked, who have you been fighting with? And she denied that and said, I haven't gotten in a fight. And her mother said, you're lying. Look at your dress. At this point, Joe's mother looked down and could see that her dress was covered with blood. She hadn't even realized she was bleeding until now and traced the pathway of the blood up to her nose. So she had a bloody nose that she could not explain. And as a result of coming in late, she received what she called, quote, the beating of her life. So that was a very traumatic incident for her. Her health suffered. She had some jaw pain, headaches, and earaches. And this kind of intrigued Joe because he had recently suffered from some pretty severe unexplained nosebleeds. Bad enough that he had to seek medical attention. And this is when the doctor told him something that really surprised him. The doctor said, you've got the most deviated septum I've ever seen in my life. Have you ever had your nose broken? Which of course Joe hadn't. He later learned that some contactees do report sinus problems, but he wondered if this could be something that had happened to him during his encounters. How amazing is that? Joe finding out that his mother had also had contacts really shook him up, but it also provided a level of confirmation that I think brought some level of comfort as well. Finding out he had medical evidence supporting his encounters was also a level of confirmation. So now he knew. I mean, there was no doubt that he was a contactee. It was undeniable. This brought UFOs to the forefront, became a pretty big part of his life. He was really seeking answers as to what was going on with him. And this really ramped up his contacts. He began having a series of amazing sightings, was able to capture some of them with a camera. He got photographs. So a lot of evidence to support his case. He brought more witnesses in. His friends, his girlfriend, they had encounters as well along with him. So he now started having actual telepathic communication and what we call downloads. So I call this next segment More Sightings and Telepathic Contact. And it brought a whole new understanding to what was going on with him. But one day Joe spoke with a neighbor from down the street and mentioned his UFO experiences when the man said he'd always wanted to see a UFO, and it was at that moment a bright light appeared in the sky behind the man. And Joe shouted, "Turn around! Look!" The two of them observed a bright object darting around, and it quickly took off. So this was an incredible synchronicity. His neighbor said, "Thank you for showing me my first UFO." He was obviously very impressed and slightly freaked out. In fact, from that day on, the neighbor avoided Joe. They never spoke again. And it was at this point that Joe was beginning to see a lot of UFOs. It seemed like whenever he'd look up into the night sky, right where he stared, a star-like object would appear, dart around, and disappear. He said this happened many times. Other times during the day, he'd be outside and a flash of light would catch his eyes, and looking up, he'd see this silver kind of cigar-looking craft, and it would usually promptly disappear. He did notice a weird pattern. If he would stare at the object and not take his eye off of it, it would remain in view. But if he tried to get a picture or another witness, or if he even so much as blinked, it would disappear. It was kind of this frustrating game of peekaboo, which provided just enough excitement to keep him hooked, but no real answers. But after many attempts, Joe was finally successful in obtaining a number of photographs, some of which clearly show an anomalous object. One such incident happened in March of 2007. Joe and his friend decided to try and capture some UFO photographs because they had been seeing a lot of these objects, and were not having any luck when suddenly Joe clearly heard his girlfriend mentally, telepathically calling his name. It was very strong, and she was at home, so Joe felt compelled to rush home, and it was at that moment a UFO appeared, and this is when his friend quickly snapped a few photos of this tiny little disc, as they called it. But Joe's compulsion to return home was now overpowering, so they rushed home, and this is when they found Joe's girlfriend sitting on the couch, and she said something was here above the house. This was when Joe and his friend were out looking for UFOs, and she said she felt this sudden impulse to go outside and saw a, quote, large, round, dark mass. It had little lights blinking all around the circumference, and she knew immediately it was one of Joe's UFOs. Because when she had first met him, he warned her that UFOs followed him around, and she thought he was just trying to push her away. But he assured her that if they were going to be together, she would soon know the truth. And by the time of this sighting, she already knew, but it was still disconcerting. And now seeing this UFO hovering low overhead, she ran back inside and screamed for Joe to come home. And Joe heard her telepathically quite some distance away. It was following this incident they did notice a weird smell of sulfur in their home, but it was that same exact night something very incredible happened. Joe had a follow-up sighting to his 1999 encounter where he had seen that beautiful diamond-like object which spoke to him telepathically and said, "No, not now," sent down a beam of light and disappeared. It was just a few hours after this sighting that had just occurred. Joe was relaxing in bed, had just closed his eyes when this weird, strange writing began to scroll across his field of vision. His eyes were closed, but he could see this weird cursive-looking script rolling past, only in his mind's eye. He couldn't make any sense of it. It was just coming and coming. And then, at the bottom of all this, he saw what he described as, quote, a funky-looking gray. And it had a hand extending towards him, and just to the right of it was that same spinning diamond-shaped object that he had seen in 1999. So this freaked him out. He opened his eyes, and all of it disappeared. He closed his eyes again, and there it was, that strange script, the same gray, and the same diamond-shaped UFO. As Joe says, I couldn't process what I was seeing, so I got up and went to the bathroom. I looked out the window, and there's this object, less than 50 yards away from me. It looked like a glowing red fez hat, bright cherry red. It had a blinking strobe on the bottom of it. So Joe went to the bathroom, woke up his girlfriend. He expected it to be gone by the time he returned, but it was still there, and they observed it together. It was about the size of a small car, maybe 200 feet over the alley behind their house, and Joe pointed it and said, "That's one of them." So at this point he grabbed his phone, called his friend who lived in an apartment across the way there, And Joe told him to go outside and look, that there was a UFO. And it was a weird thing because there was this interference over the phone that garbled up Joe's speech. He had to make himself understood. But he did, and his friend grabbed his new digital camera, the same one that he had used to capture a UFO picture just hours ago, and ran to the window. Sure enough, there was the object. He pointed the camera at it, and the power went instantly dead. So Mark ran inside, put in new batteries. The camera was working again. He pointed at the object, and the camera went dead again. And this is when he moved the viewfinder away from the UFO, and the camera immediately returned to normal power. So testing this, Mike repeated this procedure 3 times, pointing the camera at the UFO, and each time it would go dead. So it was clear to him that this object did not want to be filmed. So they watched it for about 20 minutes before it suddenly shrank down and disappeared. Well, Joe now had the proof he was craving that, this is absolutely something he could confirm, and there's undeniable. There was still a frustrating aspect to all of this, because they seemed kind of playful with him. The deep answers to what was going on with him were still eluding him, and it was frustrating because although he would go out there and have these sightings and these amazing interactions, that's all it really was. He wasn't having onboard experiences. He wasn't seeing humanoids. So this was in some ways frustrating, but in some ways satisfying. Now everything changed. He had a whole new perspective when he had another really strange and extraordinary encounter that's just a bit different. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard an encounter quite like this one. This brought, again, a whole new perspective to what was going on with him. I call this next segment ETs or Something Else. And yeah, this is a weird one. 1 month after seeing that glowing red UFO that they just could not photograph, this was April 3rd, 2007, Joe had one of the strangest encounters of his life. He and his girlfriend had just gone out to eat, and as they returned home, a dark storm cloud descended over their neighborhood. So they rushed home, brought the dogs inside. Joe was in his bedroom when the bedroom light bulb started to pulsate in brightness. And it was at this moment a huge rushing wind rattled the house, and it sounded to Joe almost like a tornado. And this is when the power to the house went out. So Joe went outside to investigate and saw that his entire block, the power had gone out. But it was only their block. That was weird. And looking up, Joe saw what he first assumed was lightning. Except, as Joe says, there were different colors. Pink, orange, blue, violet. And the clouds were so low, it looked like the bottom of a storm front just a couple of 100 feet above us. It was really strange. Now, with the power out, the traffic light near their home was also off, and the street in front of their house was backed up with traffic. Horns were honking as impatient drivers competed to get through this busy 4-way intersection. Joe had a small emergency flashlight in his hand, and he shined it towards himself to see if it worked. And about 600 feet from his house, there was this large, majestic oak tree. And as if in response to flashing his flashlight, this bright, pulsating sphere appeared next to the oak. This intrigued Joe, so he blinked his flashlight 3 times at it. At this point, this single sphere became 3, all of which pulsated brilliantly. And Joe's heart raced. He said it felt almost like he was having a panic attack. And he shouted for his girlfriend. She did not come, and that was weird. Now the street in front of him was still filled with cars at this point, but nobody seemed to notice these brilliant lights. Joe flashed the flashlight again 3 times. The lights flashed back 3 times. He says it was almost like they were playing Simon Says. And, as he says, I clicked my flashlight on and off, and it would respond in kind. And the 3rd time, it was like time stopped. It was like time stood still. I couldn't move except for my eyes. The cars that were in front of my house, they're all gone. So Joe could hardly believe what he now saw. As he says, it looked like a little glowing, swirling cloud rotating counterclockwise, and it's coming down the street. This was clearly not a normal cloud. It was tiny. It was strobing and blinking in a weird stop-action pattern. And as he says, it looked about 6 feet wide, and it's dripping tendrils of fog. Then it comes to rest just in front of my porch, 6 feet away. So at this point, the area is completely silent. This cloud is swirling counterclockwise, and it flattens out to reveal a brilliant blue center. He said it looked like beautiful emerald water moving in a swirling whirlpool pattern, while lightning-like flashes sparked out from the perimeter. And emerging from the center of this pool was a head. Joe immediately saw that there were braids done in a sort of herringbone style. It was a woman, human-looking, but clearly not quite human. As Joe says, she shimmered as she slowly came out of it. I could see the top of the forehead, the face, the eyes. They looked like they were dark, blackish, but they were indigo blue or a deep violet color. She had a yellowish-orange diamond in the center of her forehead that was glowing bright. And then, as she emerged even further, I could see what looked like a wide, thick necklace, a chest piece almost, just on top of her breasts, and it was gold, like real gold, 24 karat, and lapis lazuli. It was inlaid, gold, lapis, all around her neck. Her body, when it emerged, stopped right about where the belly button would be. So he's getting a good look at her. She's got no belly button, no fingernails, gold gauntlets on her arms, really wide bracelets, and she extended her hands forward with her palms upward in a sort of greeting gesture, and tilted her head back with her mouth open. And he got a shock because her mouth was not normal. It was like a black hole. No tongue, no roof of her mouth, no teeth, just a black hole. She then placed her palms together over her head and started spinning. She then began to move back and forth in a figure 8 infinity pattern across the entire 40-foot length of Joe's front yard. There was a bright flash of light like a grenade. Everything lit up bright white light, blinding Joe for just a second, and she was gone. At that point, everything went back to normal. The cars are back on the street honking. The porch light is working. The dogs are barking. Joe's girlfriend came rushing out onto the porch and told him that she had been trying to cross the living room floor when she heard Joe calling her name, and she became paralyzed, unable to move. Finally, her paralysis broke, and she ran outside, still feeling dazed. There was no evidence of what had just happened, other than they still had electrical problems. So this was a weird experience, and Joe wondered, what was that? Could it have been E.T.? He doesn't think so, and the more he researched his case, he started to consider other possible explanations, and he wondered if what might be happening to him could be better explained as jinn encounters, a sort of trickster spirit with dazzling supernatural powers. And there were other strange incidents that had been occurring for years that made him consider this explanation. Sometimes they would hear scratching on the walls, they'd have cabinet doors opening, slamming closed by themselves, weird odors, ghostly apparitions, unexplained sounds, and this latest visitation seemed like just another variation of the many other manifestations. And there were still UFO sightings. In 2011, Joe had another sighting of a glowing object in the shape of an ice cream cone just off the horizon, and he sent out a mental message. "I see you up there." This object remained in place, but dimmed when a plane approached, then flared back up. He watched it for 15 minutes when it disappeared. He checked the next night and it was there again. He told his co-worker, who also saw it. The object disappeared, and after that, it was gone. Another truly extraordinary encounter. Again, I can't say I've heard anything quite like it, but absolutely, it's obviously related to what's going on with him. And with this wide variety of paranormal events, psychic events, all these really unusual paranormal activity, I can see why this really caused Joe to question what's going on here and consider alternative explanations. I don't think he's ruling out extraterrestrials, but it's clear to him that there's quite a bit more going on here than just that. So this kind of brought his experiences to a level of understanding where he was able to live with them. It became a normal part of his life. And it still is. To this day, this is something he deals with. And that's true with most contactees. It's something that they learn to process into their daily life and just live with it. So I'm going to close this up with the final segment I call Conclusions, where Joe gives a statement on how he feels about all of this. So Joe continued to have sightings and still does. He no longer records them. He says there seems to be little to gain from it. The trickster aspect of his encounters, he says, no longer fools him. He continues to maintain a strong interest in the subject, but as to exactly what's going on with all of this, his mind remains open. Yes, it might be extraterrestrial, but more likely he thinks he's being contacted by an intelligent entity that is able to manifest in different forms. As he says, I think it's the same character wearing different masks. I really do. Joe estimates that he's had somewhere around 30 sightings or encounters. This is not including the paranormal incidents. But for some reason, he's not sure why, he attracts UFOs. He does have one additional memory that he thinks might be significant and connected to all of this, perhaps explaining his connection to UFOs. He says it's hard to talk about because it's so strange. But in this memory, Joe is with a group of beings looking at a viewing screen at an image of Earth. And Joe told this group of beings that although it wasn't his turn, he would go there. He would live on Earth. And the group agreed that this was a good idea. So he wonders, is this a pre-life memory, a past life memory of him as an ET agreeing to reincarnate on Earth? Joe isn't sure, but as he says, it's a memory. I don't think it's a dream. It's been so strong and persistent, and I've remembered it for so long. So there you go. That is the story of Joe Gardner's experiences. How amazing is that? So extensive. It's not often I get to interview someone who's got that many experiences, so much high strangeness, and absolute conscious recall. I have to give Joe kudos. He's such an amazing guy. So thank you, Joe. I'm just so honored that you shared your experiences, not only with me, but with the world. I think his story is really an important one. I know that a lot of people I've interviewed do feel they're dealing with extraterrestrials in the classic sense, people from other planets. I don't think Joe has ruled that out, but given the high strangeness of his experiences, I absolutely understand why he's considering alternative explanations. So interesting. So yeah, thank you again, Joe. And that's it for today. Again, his story is told in my book, Onboard UFO Encounters. Couldn't tell the whole thing here. It's very complex, and there's a lot more to it. So if you would like to check that out, certainly I would appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. It's out there. Most important of all, keep having fun, and I will see you next Friday for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Bye for now.